Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to part two of our look at Frank Lloyd Wright during that late period in his career. And I'm taking a look at four buildings individually, but looking at them all through the same lens, specifically the self-styled prophetic role that Wright developed for himself. We've already taken a look at Falling Water as an example of architecture in the landscape, and we've taken a look at Johnson Wax on the appropriate architecture for corporate America. And now we're going to take a look at Taliesin West as what we would call sustainable architecture. Taliesin West was the winter home for the architectural community that Wright had gathered around himself. Up on the upper right of the screen, we're taking a look at a distant view of Taliesin. That was that compound in southern Wisconsin where he had gathered with his family, with his business associate, with his pupils, and it really was sort of an architectural commune. But decades earlier, when Wright was going to California and going to Japan in search of projects and commissions, he had traveled through the American Southwest, and he became mesmerized with the landscape and with the space out there. And a couple of years later, as he began to pull himself out of the personal difficulties that he had, but while the nation was still gripped by the aftermath of the Great Depression, he purchased some property outside Scottsdale, Arizona, and he began to purchase some property outside Scottsdale, Arizona, and he began to build a winter home for his architectural community. The idea being that they would spend the warm months up in Wisconsin, and then as it began to get cold, he and the community would travel south to Scottsdale and spend the winter months out there. And a lot of what we're going to be taking a look at here is designed in response to the climate. In the wintertime, the desert can be really quite pleasant during the day. It can be dry and sunny, and the sun can be strong and warm things up quite nicely. But the winter can be really brutal, the evenings can really be pretty brutally cold, and there can be some great swings in temperature between day and night. And Wright was looking for ways in which he could harness the beneficial aspects of the climate in Arizona and make the buildings inhabitable even during the bitterly cold winter nights in this location. Now, if we take a look at the plan, you'll see that there's very clearly some basic geometry, but that everything is angled at a 45-degree angle, right? We've got squares, but they're angled as diamonds. The program for the original Taliesin West, and by the way, Taliesin is the name that he gave to the architectural commune in Wisconsin, and so the winter home was going to be Taliesin West. The program here is going to have a whole variety of different spaces. It's going to have studio space, it's going to have living space, it's going to have dormitory space, it's going to have dining room, kitchen, as well as a private suite for Wright and Olga Vanna. And in organizing all of this, he angled it all at 45 degrees, and he separated out the different functions so that to get from one thing to the next, you're going to have to alternate between inside, outside, inside, outside. And this was the opportunity to develop patios where you could enjoy the sunshine on a nice day, and patios that also would allow breezes to come through and to cool things off if it was just getting to be too hot. The interior spaces tend to be sunken down a little bit, and so that they're sort of within the earth to a degree. But he designed a system here that was going to, on the one hand, draw inspiration from two historical examples of desert architecture, but also serve a function in what we would call passive design or sustainable architecture. One set of desert buildings that he took inspiration from included some of the archaeological remains of masonry architecture that we can see in the American Southwest, as well as, in one particular way, some of the desert architecture that we can see in Egypt. And this was going to inspire thick concrete walls that he was going to design and that his assistants were going to build on site. These concrete walls were going to contain boulders that were collected on the site. And if you take a look at this wall here, you can see that they very carefully designed the formwork so that the wall itself has a very distinctive geometry to it. The bottom parts of the wall are battered, meaning they have a slight angle to them. There are some horizontal striations in the wall, which were placed there by protrusions in the formwork. And they also very carefully placed the boulders so that you wouldn't lose sight of the boulders if they had been completely engulfed in the concrete. And so the geometry that he's using here, that battered wall, is certainly something that drew inspiration from ancient Egyptian architecture, even though desert architecture and the use of masonry in a desert setting in general was his inspiration. Now, these walls are organized almost always in a southerly direction in the complex. And that means that over the course of the day, they're going to get hit by the direct rays of the sun, and the concrete and the stone are going to absorb the heat from the sun, from the sunlight. Over the course of the day, the heat is going to transfer through the thickness of the stones and the concrete wall. And so in the evening, the heat will have gone through the thickness and begin to radiate out into the interior of the spaces. This is something called thermal lag, and it's a time lag between when the outer exposed surface of the masonry begins to heat up and when that heat begins to radiate out to the inside of the space. And so Wright was very cognizant of the fact that these thick masonry, these thick concrete walls were going to absorb the heat and we're going to radiate them out into the interior space during the evening. The other part of the whole scheme is going to consist of fins of wood and wooden frames with canvas stretched over them that are going to sit within those different fins. And the inspiration from this came from some of the tent architecture that we can see in different desert settings, Bedouin tents in North Africa or on the Arabian Peninsula. The interesting thing about these panels is that they were completely movable. And so during the course of the day, if you decided that it was nice enough outside and that you wanted to get some sunlight in to warm up the inside space, you would just shift some of them further down the fin and just open up the roof. If you decided that you wanted to get a breeze in, but you wanted to maintain the shade, you would simply move the lower one a little bit to allow an opening for breezes to come through, and then the upper ones would still provide some shade to the interior space. And so this completely operable roof system was something that could be adjusted continuously as the occupants needed in order to create livable interior spaces. But both of these together, the concrete walls and then the fins with those movable panels, created interiors that could be regulated to a degree using low technology, low energy, but taking advantage of the characteristics of the desert climate during the winter months. The interior spaces tend to face tend to have windows that face in a northerly direction. And this was going to be something that's beneficial specifically for the studio space. If you're designing a studio or a gallery, you'll often want to have windows facing to the north because the chromatic quality of the light that comes in from the north is much more regular than the light that comes in from the east, the south, or the west. During the course of the day, as the sun rises, transverses the sky, and then sets, depending on the clouds and the atmosphere, the light can start off and finish with a sort of rosy glow to it. And at midday, it can have sort of a golden hue. But light that comes in from the north tends to have a cool, slightly bluish quality to it. And even though it's going to change in intensity between dawn and midday, the chromatic quality is going to be much more constant. And this is going to help if you're doing anything with color because it's not going to change the way that you perceive the color. And so the northerly direction that many of these spaces have allowed for some of that constant northern light to come into the interior spaces. But again, Wright was doing what he could to harness the beneficial aspects of life in the desert while creating inhabitable interior spaces. Like we've seen at Falling Water, you would never confuse the complex with a naturally occurring event. However, the use of local stone certainly allows the concrete walls to coordinate with the landscape. And Wright hoped by the overall composition that the building too would find a place within the landscape. And so for as much as this is designing for the landscape, just like Falling Water, there's another aspect here that I wanted to focus on, and that was what we would call sustainability, the passive systems that are used here for creating inhabitable spaces. The last building that we're going to take a look at is the Guggenheim Museum, which was one of his great commissions from the 1950s. When we take a look at a museum, there are a number of things that will be interesting for us to examine. With the advent of the modern era, or post-1750, we begin to see the effort to democratize culture. And that means that rather than having literature and philosophy and learning and the arts as the purview of the wealthy and the aristocracy, there were efforts to open up culture to everyone, regardless of social status, regardless of wealth. And so we see the establishment, for example, of lending libraries. We see the establishment of museums. The artwork that the museums contained were no longer just the private possessions of noblemen, nor were they only the purview of the church, but now they were put in settings where anyone could come and enjoy them and be edified by the artwork. Often, not always, but often, the artwork was going to be displayed in palaces for the royalty or the nobility that no longer served their original purpose. Sometimes it was a change in the government, sometimes it was a change in social economic norms, whatever it was. Often these enormous palaces that served the royalty or the nobility were no longer used primarily as residences for an extended family, but were now open to people so that they could come and enjoy the artwork. What we're taking a look at here in the bottom two images, obviously, is not the Guggenheim. This is the Louvre in Paris, the French royal family's official residence in the city of Paris that no longer served as the seat of royal power in Paris. Rather, as a result of the revolution and changes in the government that followed, it was open to the public so that people could come in and enjoy the architecture, enjoy the art that was actually part of the architecture, but also enjoy the collection, enjoy the artwork that had been collected and put on display here. Now, when we think about the art that was put on display in many of these newly opened museums, um, a lot of it was traditional Western art, meaning that it was narrative or that what was being depicted referred back to some story, often literature of one sort or the other. Sometimes it came from history, sometimes it came from pure literature, sometimes it came from scripture, right? There was a variety of literary sources that often these would depict. So the artwork was often narrative. The artwork was figurative, meaning that it depicted something that we recognize. The painting that we're taking a look at here depicts human beings and horses and swords, for example. Um, and often there was a rendering of space that demonstrates a clear understanding of perspective. In other words, the ability to use a system to accurately recreate three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. And these were all standard aspects of Western art from the time of the Renaissance up until the early 20th century. And it was kind of fitting that artwork like this was going to be displayed in palaces like the Louvre. Because for as much as the artwork, whether it was the painting or the sculpture, was going to respect classical principles, so too the architecture respected classical principles with its central axis, its symmetry about the axis, tripartite design, etc., etc. Right? And so there was sort of a correspondence between the art and the architecture, between the building of the museum and the pieces of painting or sculpture that were displayed within them. Right? It all kind of held together in this cohesive whole. But what do you do when you've got paintings like this? Here we've got an example of Jackson Pollock's works from the middle of the 20th century, and the other view shows Jackson Pollock as he's creating one of his paintings. I'll just point out the obvious here. A, there's no perspectival depth that he's creating on this surface. It's not narrative to the extent that it tells a story from literature or history or any sort of religious story. And it's not figurative. It's not intending to depict anything that we know from life. Rather, it's about pigment on a canvas, which really, when you take painting down to its essential elements, that's what a painting is. It's pigment applied onto a canvas. Now, there may be a little bit of a narrative here that Pollock was hoping to convey, but the narrative was about how the artist created the work. How did the artist apply the paint onto the canvas? But again, he's not trying to do anything other than allow this to be pigment on a canvas. So what is the appropriate museum for this? What is the appropriate way to move through the space for this? Is it going to be an axial organization of spaces? Is it going to be basic geometric volumes lined up symmetrically along an axis? Good question. That's something that Frank Lloyd Wright had to examine when he was given the commission for the Guggenheim Museum. Solomon Guggenheim, seen in the upper photo all the way to the left, was a wealthy collector of modern art and decided that he wanted to establish a foundation that would put his collection on permanent display and make it available to people. He established the creation of the Guggenheim Foundation in his will, and he also, even before he died, commissioned from Frank Lloyd Wright a design for the museum that was going to house his collection. Wright came up with the building. Initially, they hoped that they would be able to put this building in Central Park, where it would be surrounded in this bucolic setting with all of these beautiful lush trees. But that didn't happen, and so instead the museum now lines one side of one of the large avenues that runs north-south up the island of Manhattan. Wright and Guggenheim together were able to discuss the appropriate setting for modern art and the appropriate way to experience modern art. And for as much as Wright deserves credit for the design here, Guggenheim was a very involved patron with the project. What's interesting about this building in many ways is the circulation that Wright established in the building, which determines how you actually experience the art. If we take a look at this plan of the ground floor, you can see that the whole complex is sort of divided into two separate little settings. The one to the left is going to be the ticket office and the administration, and then the one to the right is going to be the museum proper. And the museum is if you take a look at the model down below, is sort of an inverted cone with a cylindrical atrium covered by a skylight right in the center of that inverted cone. Taking a look at the plan, you would enter by number 1 sort of at 8 o'clock, if we take a look at the circular shape of the ground floor there. And then you were supposed to find your way over to what is about 10 o'clock on the plan, where there would be an elevator which would take you to the top of the inverted cone. And from the top, you would find yourself on this walkway that spiraled down around that cylindrical atrium in the center. And so from exiting the elevator, you had this leisurely descent, right? Easier than ascending, right? So it's leisurely, not steep at all. And so it's this sort of ambling descent coming down in a spiral around that central atrium. Now, if we take a look at the section here, we can see that there is a difference between the verticality of the interior atrium and the slight angle that we see on the exterior walls of the inverted cone. And that means that the path is going to change ever so slightly as you descend. And so as you get down, the whole process becomes a little bit tighter before you reach the ground floor once again. But as you're descending this spiral, as you're descending around that atrium, the artwork is displayed on the exterior wall. And so you have this leisurely process of passing by the artwork and experiencing it in a very different context than the traditional palace-like museum. This organization is actually going to create a series of challenges for the artwork. First of all, for as much as painters were hoping to re-examine what a painting actually consists of, it still is stretched canvas on a rectangular frame. And that's not always easy to affix onto walls that are curved and that angle out. In addition, if you take a look, you can see between these interior views and the section, you can see that there are continuous windows around the upper parts of these walls. And that's a bit of a problem because this is located on one of the north-south avenues, and just because of its position and being surrounded by high buildings, most of the light is going to come in from the southwest and the west. And so the light is going to have that ever-changing chromatic quality that sort of throws off the color of some of the paintings during the course of the day. Nevertheless, it is a highly identifiable building. It's become a landmark in its own right. And even though there has been an addition put on in the last 30 years, the addition being that vertical slab that you can see in the photograph on the left, the architecture firm that put that addition on had the benefit of a sketch that Wright had completed before his death, where he showed what he imagined an addition might be. And so they were able to faithfully recreate, to the extent possible, Wright's intentions. But it's a really interesting essay in what is the appropriate experience for examining modern art. Now, all of this was happening. Wright was doing all of this architecture and exploring all these things and sounding that prophetic voice while international modernism was expanding in Western Europe, when it was being brought to the United States, and when it was proliferating largely in a corporate way around the United States. Wright always went his own way and sort of plowed his own path. And so it's not surprising that his architecture was always going to be unique, regardless of what other designers were doing. In the weeks ahead, we're going to enter into what maybe is the most interesting part of this course, when we take a look at a whole series of individual architects and examine them with this question: how did this architect develop upon international modernism? As international modernism became in many ways the norm for designers in the middle of the 20th century, we're going to see that a whole series of designers wanted to make modernism their own and put their own thumbprint on modernist design. And so they're certainly going to learn their lessons from the radical post-World War I rationally inspired modernism of the 1920s, but they're all going to take it in a different direction. And as we move forward, this is going to be the question that we ask with our look at Aalto, Barragan, Scarpa, Kahn, Japanese architects, etc.